So, so we have the Sevilles in California, and grandfather decided that he would, or they decided, for grandfather to get a degree. So he started going to I think a Bible college, or maybe it was seminary. I'll look that up. And so grandmother Seville carried on with the little family in California until they later on went east to Toronto, and there grandfather worked for the China Inland Mission. And by now we're getting along in years. Don't worry, Kate said we got to get my parents together. So Janet went to Muskegon, which is a school in, I think it's in Canada. Yeah. Anyway, my mother went to Newburgh Free Academy. Aren't you glad we got into Newburgh now? Now, Brandon and your father and I went to Newburgh to see my mother's high school. But she graduated when she was like 17, because she had skipped a couple of grades, and went to Russell Sage Women's College. But anyway, to go back to Newburgh, the Newburgh Free Academy was a premier high school with a history going back a long ways. And my mother was quite proud of her going there, and Aunt Edith went there too, because by now the Sevilles had gone from Toronto to Newburgh. Well, we'll tell about that another time. But my mother, because after all this is my story, or my mother's story rather than the whole family, she had like 100 in her Latin Regents, 100 in her math Regents, and in the days when a Regent's degree was something. And she would say, when my children were at the age of Regencies, there's always a heat wave during the June week of the Regencies. So the decades and decades of overly hot weather during Regents Week. Anyway, so she graduated pretty young, and the way that things were done in those days is, so she was going to Russell Sage, and I'm really not sure why that was decided upon for her, but it was more like a transition time for colleges. In fact, she probably was right in the middle of that. So there were women's seminaries, a ladies' seminary, where young women were taught, but without such an emphasis on scholastics, I think. And then comes the push for women to have equal education, and so they didn't just learn the skills of housekeeping, which, however, don't forget, are pretty massive if you have to keep your household running and have clean sheets on the beds and a meal or a dinner time, which means going to market and also preparing every last bit of food for the table, of which I have a couple of cookbooks, and it's a lot of work. It's not just instant mashed potatoes or something from the freezer. It's starting with a potato and turning it into something to eat. So, but my mother was, she was going to be preparing for secretarial work at Russell Sage. Her she and the ladies at Russell Sage, with whom she remained friends for her whole life. Not all of them, but a number of them were these flappers.
Mm.
So they're cutting their hair and pulling their skirts up and wearing turn-down hose and 5'2", eyes of blue. Oh, what those 5 feet can do. Has anybody seen my gal? If you happen to, 5'2", covered with fur, diamond rings, all those rings, bet your life it isn't her. Coochie coo, coochie coo, coochie, coochie, coochie coo. Has anybody seen my gal? So that's, my mother used to, she would demonstrate the Charleston to her children.
And her grandchildren, right?
And maybe her grandchildren. So it was a pretty exciting time to be alive. And I don't know how much to put in here, but my mother remembered coming out of a movie theater and seeing the sign on the advertisement board, Lindbergh flies the Atlantic. So that is another peg to put my mother's history on. This is the times that of her youngest or younger adult years. And there was still a very sequestered element to women's education at that time. So she took the train from Newburgh to Schenectady, and she had her laundry box, comme ça, in which she would put her laundry, send it home to Newburgh, and it would be returned by her mother, all laundered and ironed and folded, and that was how the laundry system worked. I mean, I'm sure there were some people who had their laundry done locally, but not my mother, because they were on shoestring. And a snack that they had in their dorm was chili sauce and peanut butter and saltines. So you can try that. That's not ketchup, it's chili. I think it's still being sold, the Heinz chili sauce, which is more tomatoey, more vegetable-y. And I think that my grandmother, who was a great seamstress, sewed all my mother's clothes. That was part of their existence. And my mother also could do quite nice sewing and tailoring. Yep. Let's see. So anyway, so she goes through Russell Sage and becomes a secretary, and she finds a job up in Potsdam, where there's a teacher's college. I don't know if there was some kind of a personal connection there or not. But there she went, and so she's a secretary. There was a photograph of this big room and office. She worked at Crane School of Music, which we will find reappearing in our family history in time to come. So there she is, and pretty far from home, and that's where she met Roger Barnes Van Buskirk. he was attending Clarkson at the time, although he did not finish his degree, because by now we're in the choppy waters of the 30s with very many economical challenges for all the people of those times, trying to get jobs, trying to stay in school, trying to, if you didn't have a lot of money to start with, then you're hit hard by circumstances of that decade. So my father was actually chosen to selected to do a joint degree between, I don't know, Clarkson Engineering School and GE or something. Anyway, maybe my sister knows that. But then after 2 years, instead of ending up with 2 degrees, he ended up with no degrees. But he had his engineering education, and so he ended up working as an engineer in a factory in Watertown. Am I getting ahead of myself? Somewhat. So my mother and dad met and were very absorbed in each other. And towards the end of my mother's life, we were talking about her life. Or maybe it was someone else in our family. But anyway, she said, I could still remember your father swinging down the street in his coat, because my dad was very well coordinated and very strong. So he was a good dancer and swam and whatever. He played, when he was growing up in his teens, played football, just not for, I don't think he played for Watertown High, because he actually had a couple strikes against him as far as participating in athletics. I think he could have golfed anyway, but he didn't play tennis or, some of the more esoteric sports. But he sure could, when called upon, come through with a throw or a catch.
What were the couple strikes against him that you're talking about?
Because he was an odd one out. He was a son of a single mother, and so he was. He grew up with 2 older cousins and two older girl cousins and 1 boy cousin, in a very on a very respectable a very respectable address on a very respectable street in Watertown. A very fine big house. And my Aunt Ada, who's the sister of my grandmother Frances Maud Barnes Williams, was a very welcoming and hospitable person. And because she had this big house and had enough money, I mean, people gravitated to staying there and living there. So her sister, Florence, Ada's sister Florence, was my grandmother's sister, because there's 3 girls in that family. Florence and her husband, Oscar, lived on Mullen Street Ada's house during the Depression. Oscar worked, I don't know if they lost their money or they just didn't have much money, worked as a bookkeeper for a business in Watertown. But this is very interesting for me too, because I'm putting things together that I haven't really put together. So we have Ada and Frank Williams in a big house on Mullen Street. And Frances, my father's mother, had a degree from Clarkson and was a widow. And so she got a job in Detroit in a settlement house. Did I already tell you this?
Right. We did that bit.
And then we took a different.
Right.
So, so my father looked forward to her coming from Detroit to Watertown, and there he would have her. He would spend a lot of time with her in summer. But in some ways, I think everybody who is listening probably gets a picture of a child who's a bit out of it. The older children that are part of his family are not his siblings, and they kind of have their own lives. And so he isn't included in their life. But he did have some very good friends in Watertown as he was growing up in his grade school and high school years. Is that enough?
Hold on. Let's take a pause, please.